right, so I kind of cheated a little bit and picked the two most well-known songs from the Beach Boys for the montage and the opener. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason I wanted to do that was because I wanted to kind of make it an entree for those that might not be familiar with this album, to give you some songs you're familiar with, because there are a lot of songs that are deep cuts for the band, yes, as well as songs that if you're a Beach Boys fan, you would say are amongst your favorite songs. But let me kind of go with some general questions, guys. Let me throw out some different stuff, okay?
Oh,
so I'm going to invert the structure of this discussion. So there are many questions that come from Pet Sounds. The first is this a Beach Boys album or is this a Brian Wilson album? Matt, what are your thoughts real quick?
It's like hardball.
Yep.
I still say it's a Beach. I mean, obviously it's a Brian Wilson album, but it does sound like the Beach Boys. It's got the vocals, it's got the the harmonies. When you hear it, it's like it's a Beach Boys record, right? So I know Brian Wilson's the driving force behind it, but I'm not. It's definitely sounds like a Beach Boys record. So I'm going to go with that.
Okay, Josh?
I agree. I mean, he's always been kind of the driving producer anyway, right? And it's not like they're not singing on this album and providing harmonies and other things.
Certainly throughout the 1960s, Brian Wilson is the driver until, of course, life intervenes and everybody else takes over in the 70s outside of one select album where Brian Wilson comes back.
Gotcha.
Okay.
So definitely a Beach Boys album.
You got it. Number 2. This album was produced to the rest of the band, and we'll talk about how it came about, but Brian Wilson recorded this album. Actually, this is probably as good a time to talk about it as any. Shortly after the Beach Boys did a ton of touring in the 1960s, Brian Wilson, who at the time was a huge 22 years old, stepped away from the band in 1964 and kind of said, I'm not going to tour anymore. I'm just going to kind of tinker around in the studio here. You guys, knock it out. So the other 4 Beach Boys, the 2 Wilsons, Carl and Dennis, Mike Love, and Al Jardine, grabbed Bruce Johnston, and basically Bruce Johnston became Brian Wilson on tour. So as he's doing that, Brian Wilson creates an album we've covered here before, which was Beach Boys Today. And then he also did Summer Days, Summer Nights. And that definitely shows the sophistication growing for the Beach Boys, as I think we mentioned in that episode. But then Pet Sounds was produced while the band was on the road. And so Brian Wilson went in with the Wall of Sound. The Wrecking Crew is the group as the musicians on this. So the Wrecking Crew are doing it with the Wall of Sound sort of technique. And Brian Wilson's just tinkering around. He creates this album. And the story goes that he comes back. The Beach Boys come back and are like, all right, what do you got for us, Brian? And, they knew he was kind of experimenting with stuff. But they thought it was going to be kind of more like Beach Boys Today, where there was some experimentation, but still a little bit of the Beach Boys sound. And they're delivered with this. And I guess Mike Love and Al Jardine in particular were like, how the hell are we going to sing this on tour? Like, we can't reproduce this at all. And Carl and Dennis, while acknowledging the genius, also kind of said, we're still a touring band, Brian. And there was a difference of opinion. Who do you think was right in that argument? The Beach Boys remaining members outside of Brian Wilson, who said, how the hell are we going to tour and be commercially successful with this? Or Brian Wilson of this is where we need to go sonically? Josh, thoughts?
Wow, that's something I never even thought about listening to this album and had not considered. I would say it doesn't matter. You can... Well, in today's environment, you can just pre-record stuff and play it in the background while you sing the harmonies and everything. But I think they could have figured that out after the fact, playing this album live.
Okay, Matt?
I'd say it depends on. I have 2 answers. One, if you're talking about at the time and success coming from touring, then the rest of the Beach Boys were right, because I don't think that this, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think this was received particularly well or sold.
Oh, that's going to be point number 3 here, Matt, that we're going to get into in a second.
Okay. Well, at the time, I think the time has certainly proved Brian Wilson right in this regard. But at the time, probably the band was right, because I think that they might have suffered financially after this record.
That they did.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I have 2 answers, John.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
How much did they suffer?
Well, they'd been extremely successful in the early 1960s, so they were still comfortably living. But this kicked off a string of albums that were not well regarded. I should Pet Sounds. I'm going to go back to that because it depends on how you define not well regarded from Pet Sounds. But to know the Pet Sounds mystique, though, you have to know what followed Pet Sounds, and what followed Pet Sounds was supposed to be Smile, which was released by Brian Wilson finally decades later, right?
Yeah, like 04.
04, yep.
Yeah,
and we're going to talk about that in a bonus
Noble
episode.
when that came out.
Oh.
Yep. Wow. Okay. That would have been around 05, 06, right?
Yeah. Did you get a free copy, Josh?
No, unfortunately.
No.
So Brian Wilson releases Smile decades later, so almost 40 years later. But at the time, the Beach Boys released Smiley Smile, which was considered to be a huge bust and a total dud. And not only did it not sell well and kind of set the Beach Boys back, but it also sort of defined the fact that the Beach Boys' time in the mind of many had passed and they were no longer a revolutionary artist. They followed it up with some albums lo-fi albums, one of which we've listened to and covered for a bonus episode, Wild Honey, that were wildly different and lo-fi in production, which is something you'd never say about Pet Sounds. But and then Brian Wilson largely was gone from the band after that. And one of the reasons is because the reception to Pet Sounds in America was not positive, and it did not sell particularly well. And it sort of was like, I put all this into it, and obviously people don't think that it's brilliant. So he was very wounded by that. Interestingly enough, that was the American critics' take, and to some degree the record buying public. It sold reasonably well, but the general consensus of old school Beach Boys fans was that, what is this? This isn't what the Beach Boys are supposed to be. And the Beach Boys were kind of viewed as uncool, right, by people that were starting to get into psychedelia, and certainly compared to contemporaries like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And a lot of critics have posited afterwards that part of the reason this wasn't received positively was because critics would have lost a little bit of their credibility if they said something the Beach Boys made was cool, when compared to different stuff.
Like the shifting tide of culture in a way. Is kind
you got it. Yep.
To use that beach analogy.
Yes. And the
Thanks,
rock writers... The rock writers had kind of decided the Beach Boys weren't cool, so how are you going to say that an album is an all-time classic if you've, already decided they're not cool, right?
Yeah.
Now, interestingly enough, across the pond in England, this album was immediately regarded as a step forward. In fact, it was considered to be a stronger album than anything the Beatles had done. And the press in England was very outspoken about that. Like, this is what the Beatles need to live up to, basically. And interestingly enough, English rock acts immediately represented the brilliance of, respected and recognized the brilliance of this. Musicians in general pretty much recognized this was a pretty gigantic feat quickly. So I guess before I go into a little bit more bio, like I said, we're deconstructing the segment here. I'm going to kind of go to where we usually end with, but maybe this could lead to some good discussion. What do you think, Matt? Who was right, British press or American press?
It's this is a very hard question, and I am very mixed on this album. I want to start off by saying I absolutely recognize the genius that's going on here. The arrangements, the harmonies, the structure, the complexity is insane. And just knowing the painstaking hours that Wilson put into this. The fact, how old did you say he was 22 when he did this?
24.
Or was that...
He went off the road at 22
Dude.
in 1964, and he was 24 when this got released in 1966.
This is like some Mozart level stuff that he's doing with, and he's like, so it's like. So I totally get that. And I think that there are three, for me, absolutely stellar songs on here. The way that the album opens with Wouldn't It Be Nice, that's one of my favorite songs that they have. I love how it comes in with that little, I don't know what that is, do-do-do-do. It's like the musical box thing. And then it just kicks in with the drum. And it's almost like it changes keys right on, and it just takes you in a different direction, right? When the Wouldn't It Be Nice is totally in a different key than what the musical box thing was doing. And I love the way that stuff is just really cool. It sounds great. It's a catchy song. It's upbeat. It's a lot of fun. awesome way to start the record. Sloop John B, I've always liked. I mean, the song that's just a beautiful song. The harmonies again. It's just a great melody. And then you've got the most beautiful song ever, and God Only Knows, which is just like this lush harmony. Just layering things on top of one another. Just beautiful sentiment. Stellar song. And then I get a bunch of songs which I'm like, they're pretty good, right? They got the harmonies things going on. I throw You Still Believe in Me in that. I think that there's some really good harmonies and stuff there. I'm Waiting for the Day. I Know There's an Answer, more upbeat kind of songs that I like. Here Today is a good song. I put that in category as well. And then you got some songs where I'm like, okay, it's not really doing a whole lot, but it's fine. The instrumentals I would throw in there, the pet sounds, and is it Let's Go Away for the While. And then I think that's not me, and I just wasn't made for these times. Still, okay. Like, it's, I'm not blown away by these songs. I structurally, I get it, but it's like, I don't really, I'm lukewarm on them. And then when you talk about Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder and Caroline No, yeah, they're beautiful songs, but it puts me to sleep. Like, I don't like those songs very much. So I've always been mixed on this. I've had this record for many, many years, and I've never been a Brian Wilson, fanatic. I think I can appreciate a lot of the things that he did. He certainly drove the Beatles to do more, and God knows what they would have done without them, because he was, and his records and his music.
God only knows.
There you go. Walked right into that one. So, so who knows what they would have done or how they would have been different, right? And certainly this album is something. It totally makes sense, John, that you're saying that this is something that other artists are just blown away by because they have a greater appreciation for what you have to do in a studio to make it sound like this. Yeah. I don't think I'm a huge fan of the Wall of Sound. I mean, this is the second we haven't. I know we covered the Ronettes in a bonus episode, and that was a takeaway I had there too. The echoey sound, the production. It leaves me flat, And then when I listened, I'm glad you told me to listen to Wild Honey because I missed that extra segment. I like that. And the voice, that's the other thing too. They have great voices. I get tired of the like the scooping nature of the voice. It's tiresome to me. I'm not a huge fan of that style. And I liked Brian Wilson singing on Wild Honey. Like that was something, I'm not saying it was better, right? But I'm saying
he barely sang on that album.
Well, Carl Wilson. Well, no, but he did sing on it. He did sing on it, and I noted when he did, I was like, that's a better. It's almost like a Dylan thing, right? Like where you have a really distinct voice that some people love and some people don't love. I won't say that I hate that. The Pet Sounds Brian Wilson voice. I don't hate it, but I get tired of it. I think, and a whole album of it is just, it's a bit much. So, I'm all over the place on this. I think it's a great record, but for me, it's not really something that I go back to a whole lot because I'm not a huge fan overall, I think.
Yeah, I'm similar to you. I think that the reputation of this album is carried by its technical brilliance, and sometimes I struggle to pick up on the technical brilliance of it at times, or because it's hard because we're coming from a later era where all of this stuff is kind of old hat, and so it's kind of hard. I can't hear the pieces being put together. I just hear like the harmonizing and the different sound effects and that. And so while I don't, that's not a negative for the album because I do appreciate the album and I like it. I'm not blown away by it like I am from some other Beach Boys albums. And I think even John, I think I like Wild Honey maybe more than this. The more I listen to that. Now I think on the positive side, I think the more I listen to this album and times that I've come back to it, I've noticed different things every time. And I think my appreciation for it deepens the more I listen to it. I think there's some great deep cuts on here for people that are just used to the Surf's Up Beach Boys sound. I think I Know There's an Answer is probably my favorite song that's not one of the big hits off of this one. And like Matt said, I love Wouldn't It Be Nice and Sloop John B and God Only Knows. Those are all great songs. I also don't understand why people back then didn't like this album, because it still sounds like a Beach Boys album to me. It's not something that's like radically different other than the fact that they're not talking about surfing. They're being being more introspective and talking about like existential questions and things like that. There's nothing wrong with that. I appreciate that development. So I don't know. That's the other thing. We listen to Beach Boys today. Maybe I need to listen to, well, I listen to Beach Boys Party also on my own, and that's kind of the same kind of hangout, surfs up, beach party vibe as well. So I guess, like Matt, I know John's really high on, I can't wait to hear what John has to say, but
he's gonna tell us we're nuts.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I like the album, but I don't think it's like the fourth best album of the 60s or whatever it's currently at right now. So what do you think, John? You're stunned silence.
Well, I didn't need Pitchfork or anybody to tell me why I should like this album. I think that's what the problem is for a lot of people. Like, they read about it and they try to talk themselves into it, and I've never understood that, because it just, there was never any doubt that this was a brilliant album when I listened to this for the first time when I was 12 years old. Mm-hmm. And it's still a brilliant album. It's basically Phil Spector's Wall of Sound, which was endless amounts of songs that I loved from the early 1960s. You know, I always say, if you want to hear like the Wall of Sound, think of like Do Run Run, you know, that's the basic sound, right? Mm-hmm. And then you take it and you tweak it with incredible production values, lush harmonies, and just lyrics that are just so unusual for popular music. These vulnerable, sort of introspective lyrics that no one was writing lyrics like this in that era. And once again, I think this is just one of these albums that, like, couching this in 1966 is part of understanding this, because it is basically where Phil Spector, who was largely in charge of the early 1960s, his sound meets where rock was going in the late 1960s. And Brian Wilson basically just made this fusion of these two massive musical movements and created this album. And so I can understand what Matt is saying about the instrumentals. The instrumentals are my two least favorite songs on this. Interestingly enough, the rest of the band wanted Good Vibrations in place of Pet Sounds, which would have been incredibly upgrade on this, and may have changed your mind on it, because he was doing some of the tinkering right there. But Brian Wilson wanted to hold off on that. So that's one thing to know about this, that this album could have been even better if you throw that on there. And that actually ended up on really no album. It's kind of one of those bonus tracks. But Josh mentioned, yes, there's Wouldn't It Be Nice, there's Sloop John B., which are both great songs. God Only Knows, I don't know why, as much as I like that song, I don't know why that is like always held up. I think it's because Paul McCartney said he loved that song so much, and then it just kind of became, oh, well, if Paul McCartney likes it, then it's got to be the best Beach Boys song ever. It's a great song, but for me, I know there's an answer, which used to be Hold On to Your Ego, which is a funny story in its own right, because the rest of the band, especially Mike Love, did not want to sing a song that was sort of that vulnerable. Basically, Brian Wilson wrote that on a true acid trip where he, went into that state of being egoless, and that's what that song's about. But that's probably my favorite complex Beach Boys song. I always divide the Beach Boys into like harmony Beach Boys and then complex Beach Boys. It's my favorite complex Beach Boys song. But there's gems all across. We didn't talk about That's Not Me. That's a fantastic song lyrically. And just, I really enjoy the harmonies in that song as well. I'm Waiting for the Day. Hey, listen, I'm not going to sell someone on this album if they don't feel it, because I think that part of what has hurt this album is that it was probably underappreciated in its time, and people have tripped over themselves to overappreciate it. And I think that for me, it kind of comes back down to, you should never have to listen to an album so hard to not get, get it. If you don't get it, you don't get it. But if you do get it, it's very easy to understand why this album's considered by many people to be the best album of the 1960s, because it's sonically, every time you listen to it sonically, there's different stuff you pick up. the harmonies, the wall of sound is a certain type of sound. Matt, I know from knowing you as long as I've known you, you do not like the wall of sound. So like knowing that, it's going to be hard for you to dig into this album because it very much is couched in that wall of sound approach. But hey,
I think that the weird thing is because I sometimes like it, right? When you say the Do Run Run, I'm like, that's a great, I love that song, right? I just think when you do an entire album of it, and I think that was my complaint about the Renettes album that we did, is that like, man, it kind of just all kind of blended together after a while, and I was not used to hearing it like that. So, but yeah, I think. I think that you're right, John. I think that this is definitely a record that when I first heard, like, oh my God, Pet Sounds is like this remarkable album that's on everybody's top list. And I don't think I was as young as you. I probably was maybe in early high school, maybe middle school. And I was just like, my first reaction was the Beach Boys, like, they're not cool, like a very similar thing like that. And then I listened to it and I was just like, okay, it's pretty good. It's got some those greats. I've always liked those 3 songs that I mentioned. But I've always kind of, anytime I listen to this, I feel like, all right, I'm missing something here because all these people are telling me that this is like this phenomenal album, and I need to get this because what's wrong with me? This has everything in here that I should like. I love harmony, like melody and harmonies are. In complex musical structures are like my bread and butter for the most part, right? So that's the other thing that's a little frustrating for me listening to this is like, I should buy into this. I should get it. I should be one of those people, and I'm not, right? So it's also like an interesting position to be in because, and I'm not trying to impress anybody. I'll just be like, look, I'm not going to really listen to this a whole lot. If I'm making a playlist, I'll put a couple of songs maybe from this on it, but I'm not reaching for Pet Sounds to listen to, a whole lot, to be honest.
Ironically, not enough Pet Sounds for my liking either on this. I was expecting more farm animals, random things.
I also love on the cover of this album that all the members of the band are like happily feeding these farm animals, and Mike Love looks totally disgusted.
Well, they're not they're not happily. Let me put it that they hated the name of it besides Brian Wilson, and they hated the shoot for that, and basically they hated everything about that. So, so Mike Love might have been the only one who was not able to hide his contempt, but he was not alone with the rest of the band.
He looks like he just got dumped on by a goat.
The record label also did not love that title, as you might imagine, too, with what they're doing. But a couple things I want to mention here that I haven't mentioned that probably should be mentioned. Brian Wilson worked with a songwriter on this, a guy by the name of Tony Asher, who was a jingle writer for an advertising agency, and he was largely responsible for a lot of the lyrics in this. He kind of, some people will say he sort of channeled what Brian Wilson was thinking and refined it a little bit. He kind of became disillusioned with Brian Wilson as genius, but he doesn't really build a compelling argument for why that isn't the case. He kind of says, oh, he didn't really work as hard as you think he would, and like he was unfocused some days and stuff, but I found a lot of like his stuff to seem a little maybe sour grapes. I know he only got a 25% cut, but he agreed to that ahead of time, so it wasn't kind of like they stiffed him. He did it and maybe thought he should have gotten.
Hey, I'm sure he made a lot more money than he thought he would have, though. Like that's still pretty good. That's still a lot.
Well, considering there's 5 other Beach Boys, you know what I mean? Like, and the publishing royalties, I feel like that's
and isn't that something that because wasn't Mike Love like a primary lyricist for the band?
No. Well, yes, in most albums, not on this one though.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Wasn't he?
Sued
this is
much
something
later.
Yeah,
credits,
if I'm not mistaken, this is kind of like he got really mad at Wilson in particular before kind of casting him aside, for the lyrics portion of the writing.
Well, Brian Wilson this album was sort of controversial with the band because everything you read about it, like he always viewed this as a solo album, and the rest of the band's like, hey, wait a second, man, we let you stay home and stuff, and we get it, and we respect your genius, but like the money's coming in by us going and touring and stuff, and we love what you're doing here, but come on, man, like that's kind of what the argument was. It's and I always have said I can see both sides of it because there is brilliance in what Brian Wilson's doing, and the Beach Boys themselves would have never been as artistically credible without Brian Wilson's contributions. But if Brian Wilson just worked on an album for 10 years as a perfectionist, there would be no Beach Boys either, because you eventually have to, So I'm somewhat receptive to both takes of it, but yeah. A lot of people have said, and maybe I'll ask 2 more questions and then we'll finish the segment. a lot of people have said that this album, if this album had been received better and then Brian Wilson releases Smile, which I don't know if you guys have heard, but you can definitely see it as a sister to this album in many ways. That pop music may have gone in a different direction, because at that time it was sort of lining up that the Beatles were going to be doing one thing that eventually is where pop music did end up going, and that Brian Wilson sort of represented, and his view of what the Beach Boys were doing stuff sort of represented another view of popular music that some people even say over the last 20 years has started to become more prominent, less guitar driven, less hook and harmony driven, and more sort of, lush complexions. What do you think? Do you think that's an argument that's fair, or do you think that's overstating it?
Ooh,
Josh?
I love intriguing alternate history questions, different divergent timelines of things. That's definitely interesting. There's this idea in movies, kind of around a market correction where an actor or actress is rising in popularity, and then somebody comes along and kind of steals their thunder, and they become the famous one, and they supersede that person. There's many examples of this. So, but yeah, I could see how that a different stream, like kind of pop music, would be in a different direction with more introspection and maybe more like production or wall of sound, maybe direction for things.
Yeah, that's hard, man. Like, you're talking about, hell, there's people at the butterfly effect, right? Like a little flapping of a wing can totally change, like, the course of history or the course of the future or whatever. But like, so certainly if somebody heard, we were just talking about it. Well, if the Beach Boys didn't do Pet Sounds, what would the Beatles have done, right? Because maybe they wouldn't have been inspired in that way, and they would have done something different. So certainly I could see if they had put out Smile at that time to back this up, maybe somebody hears that, somebody in a band, somebody decides to do something different, somebody is inspired and then changes it, and then there's a chain reaction. So is that possible? Sure. How expansive that would have gotten, I have freaking no idea.
Yeah.
So that's a maybe. That's a solid maybe.
So when this album came out, what Beatles album had just come out or was coming out?
Revolver was the album that was directly preceded this. And actually, it was Rubber Soul, which was the one that Brian Wilson sort of looked at as what inspired him to craft this. And then, of course, famously, the Beatles listened to this and said they were inspired by it for Sgt. Pepper, which you absolutely can see. I mean, even as I listened to Abbey Road, I could see some of the things production-wise that he was doing. I was like, oh, yeah, okay. You can see, if nothing else, and I do like Abbey Road more than I like Pet Sounds, but you can see, though, elements of what Wilson was doing, how it influenced like everybody in the late 60s, because there's just things that bands are doing that they weren't doing before he was doing them. And so that, I think, I would even say that going back to like Beach Boys today in some ways, maybe not where rock was going, but like other types of music, he was very much deconstructing that already then. So yeah, so that was one question. Go ahead.
Have you come across in your research? I think an interesting idea would be for somebody to separate all the tracks out on the song, and then you can like move sliders and like combine them together to see how the song is built. I think that'd be a cool thing.
Be a cool video game.
Yeah, exactly. Somebody could do that on the internet.
I'm sure someone's done that, and they've definitely done it for the Wall of Sound. If you want to see like the Wrecking, there's a great documentary on the Wrecking Crew.
Yeah, I've seen that documentary. That's good.
Where they basically go into how that was done and the professionalism there, and that's basically who you're hearing instrumentally on this album, along with Brian Wilson himself. So there's that, and maybe I'll leave with this question, the ultimate question, because I've posed this before. In the 1960s, I think more than almost any other decade, the idea that you were cool or not cool seems to be in the time what dedicated a lot of press to what was a great album, and I think that more so than other decades, there's been revisionist greatness in the 60s and 70s when we're going there. So my take is, are the Beach Boys underrated, overrated, or properly rated in terms of their musical contributions? Josh.
I think they're properly rated.
Gotcha.
Honestly, yep.
Okay, Matt.
Yeah, I was gonna say that too. I think that they're properly rated. I think that I think that they certainly get their due in critical, with critical acclaim. They certainly get their due with popular acclaim. I mean, do
they get their critical acclaim though? Because it's kind of like Brian Wilson is a genius, and there's Pet Sounds, and that's where the Beach Boys are good.
Yeah,
they got critical acclaim with Smile. I mean, when he did Smile in 2004, that was like
who was that? Was that a Beach Boys album or was that a Brian Wilson album?
Oh, okay, I see. I don't know. I mean, go ahead, Josh.
I was gonna say I don't think people can name Beach Boys albums in the way that they can other artists like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or something like that.
They can name hits. I mean, they were more of a hits band, a singles band, know. But I mean, this album has always been at the top, right? This is making the top of the list. This top of our list here, or at towards the top. Even if it's one record, right? Like the Velvet Underground, only had I guess they had more, but you don't need a ton of records to hold some sort of your position in the pantheon of great music. The Sex Pistols only had one album, right? And they were like the forerunners of punk, and they so I don't know if Brian Wilson or the Beach Boys needed to have multiple albums to be properly critically revered. I think that this album surely it has done enough and influenced enough people to give them their due. Without this record, I think a good question would be, without this record, would they be critically acclaimed at all? And maybe that's kind of the point that you're talking about, John. That's an interesting question.
Well, because there's some later Beach Boys albums like Sunflower and Surf's Up that are considered in the modern era to be great albums, but you won't see them anywhere in the 70s because for so many years you couldn't even have the Beach Boys sniff a chart. You know what I mean? Because they were considered to be without their genius and uncool. And that's what's always fascinating to me is like now when you hear the Beach Boys talked about by modern critics, they'll often say, Pet Sounds is a great album, but, Beach Boys Today is really an interesting look at where it's going. And then later on you have Wild Honey and Sunflower and Surf's Up. And boy, these are really great albums too. They were doing a lot of really ahead of their time stuff, but, the knock had already gotten out from the 60s generation that the Beach Boys were not cool. And that's why I would say the Beach Boys are critically underrated. But of course, you said popular acclaim. Yes, they sold a bazillion albums. But the interesting thing is the albums they sold were not the critically acclaimed ones.
So do you think they're due for reappreciation then by the newer generations?
I think it kind of comes down to, for many people, the Beach Boys are a surf band, the band that made Pet Sounds and Kokomo. And there's a lot more to the Beach Boys.
I forgot about that shitty song.
But would you not agree with that? Would that?
No,
it's totally
that's accurate.
Yeah.
That has to be their biggest hit, right?
And don't forget Full House. Their appearance on Full House.
So, the surf is that's Kokomo, because Johnson.
Exactly.
So the surf band is sort of all of them, right? Pet Sounds is Brian Wilson, and then Kokomo is like Mike Love and a bunch of imposters, right? And so it's kind of funny because there's a lot of other stuff the Beach Boys have done. That's why I'm glad we covered Beach Boys Today, because I know you guys were not a huge fan of that album, but I was. But to me, that's a real great view of where they were headed. Like if we're gonna say the Beatles with Rubber Soul and Help and Revolver were showing where they were going, like Beach Boys Today very much shows surf band Beatles to this, or surf band Beach Boys to this. And I think that it's one of those things that I'd be interested if you guys gave that a listen again, if you would see that arc. Yeah,
maybe. But yeah, that's a good point. A couple things. I did see. I've seen the Beach Boys twice. I have seen them play. I saw them play after a Marlins game.
Well, was it them or was it Mike Love?
No, it was Mike Love and John Stamos. Josh reminded me of that. It was after it was come to a baseball game and then see the quote unquote Beach Boys. But then, John, I did see Brian Wilson Beach Boys at Bonnaroo in like 2012 or something like that.
So that would
the band
probably
reunited.
Him, Al Jardine, and Mike Love and Bruce Johnson, right? Because Carl and Dennis have long since passed away.
Yes, yeah, but Brian Wilson was there, and from times of seeing him, man, I don't know if he suffered a stroke or something. He's definitely got like a slurred speech thing or something going on, but he's still I mean, for a dude that age, like trying to do the notes that he's doing, he sounds pretty good, you know. But yeah, but I would rather see that. That was a much better show than the after the post Marlins game concert I saw with John Stamos.
More appreciative audience probably too. But,
and maybe that's why the Beach Boys are not remembered, because as they got older, they played Marlins, games where the Beatles just sort of faded away from that. So.
You know what? The other thing they suffer for them, we haven't even mentioned this, but Mike Love is one of the most. Is there a more hated person in rock and roll history than Mike Love? I mean, he's got to be up there.
There's plenty of people more hated than Mike Love. I mean, he's viewed as the enemy of the Beach Boys, right? Because it's like Brian Wilson.
Just music. He was on the PMRC when they did all that stuff. He was on the side of censorship. Nobody liked him.
No, I know. I'm not going to sit here and defend Mike. The only here I said I'm not going to sit here and defend. I'll say this: it can't be easy to be in a band with a genius with significant mental health issues. I think that is probably a fair argument that what was the Beach Boys going forward going to be? If Brian Wilson was not touring, if he was not, producing anything commercially viable, if he was not able to consistently contribute, I do think that was tough. And not just for Mike Love. I think it was tough for the other two Wilsons and Al Jardine too. I think Mike Love just was the strongest personality. And so a lot of the group's frustrations sort of became personified by Mike Love, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's fair. I think you gotta, if this is your career, you have to find a way to keep moving forward, right? And hold on to the brand in a way and keep making money.
Well, I think Mike Love came from more modest means than Brian Wilson did, so he was much more into the business aspect of, hey, we got to make money here.
And they said, and Al Jardine even said, I think in an interview one time, he said, Mike loves the hooks. He wants to get to a hook and something that he can imagine singing in front of people. And Brian Wilson loved the hooks sometimes and also loved a bunch of other stuff. So, and that's what's cool about bands. They have difference of opinion. So, okay.
Just like combing the stacks.
Yep.
Just like CTS. So this has been